those of you who don't know, I'm Graham Williams, and I'm a lecturer in the history of English in the School of English here at the University of Sheffield. And I suppose that segues into my original inspiration for contacting Professor DeGraf, which was conversations that I've had over the years, actually, with my students, with undergrad students in particular, in relation to the history of English, historical linguistics, and Creole studies. So I should thank those past students. Obviously, not all those students are here, for that inspiration in asking those questions, which have challenged my own thinking, and certainly thank Professor DeGraf already for providing me with ideas and actions to actually revisit my own curriculum. So thanks to that. I should also say that the part of the motivation for well, the funds for this talk derive from my union, the University and Colleges Union Action, and the Strike Fund that derives from that. So I should thank my union and also my school for making those funds available for this great opportunity. And again, thank you to Professor DeGraf for accepting the invitation. I will not go on about the many important things Professor DeGraf has done and continues to do, because those of you who don't know already, I think it will become very apparent in his talk. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Professor DeGraf. Thank you again.
It was nice, as you were speaking, for me to go through some of the faces and the names on the screen, and it's pleasant to see people coming from really all over the world for this lecture and with the workshop. And I want to thank you again, Graham, for making this possible. So what does it mean to decolonize the curriculum in linguistics? This is a title for the workshop. And I think that this question brings in a larger question about education itself and what it means to decolonize, or maybe I should use Frantz Fanon's phrase about liberation. So what does it mean to liberate the entire enterprise of education from the shackles of colonialism, racism, classism, sexism, and all kinds of isms? I take it that all of these isms are tools or technologies to really invent, to create grades of humanity, in quote, grades of humanity, that in effect violate our fundamental human rights. So the notion of grades of humanity, I take from two 19th century scholars that should be important for linguists interested in supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. Frederick Douglass, who used linguistics. He wasn't a linguist, but he was a scholar who was very curious about all kinds of fields. So he used linguistics to try to undermine this very notion of grades of humanity or degrees of humanity. And then August Schleicher, who was a bona fide linguist, who created in the 19th century a model for language change, so the famous family tree or stem bomb theory, with the explicit purpose of reifying grades of humanity. So now, if we jump to today, December 10th, 2020, which is the anniversary of December 10, 1948, which is when the United Nations published this famous Declaration for Human Rights. So anachronistically, Douglass and Schleicher stood on opposite sides of the line separating respect versus violation of human rights, as spelled out in these documents that you see now on my screen, especially when we consider that linguistic rights are human rights as well. Now, what's more troublesome is that much work in linguistics and much work in human rights organizations, as we think of today being the Day for Human Rights. So if we think of organizations whose titles or mission statements include linguistic and cultural diversity, protection of citizens, education, justice, knowledge, liberty, and so on, many of these organizations actually stand on the side of human rights violation. In effect, in spite of the mission statements, And even in spite of other very beautiful work that they do, where they produce resources for enhancing human rights, diversity of languages, and so on, when you dig deeper at how these organizations operate, you see that they violate human rights on a daily basis. So one way in which linguistics, education, and human rights organizations, in effect, have induced violations of human rights is that even as they produce resources for or about disenfranchised communities, typically Black and brown communities in the global South, they also turn these individuals into what Michel, an anthropologist, called the savage other, that needs to be silenced in various ways. My late colleague, Michel wrote an important paper almost 20 years ago with the title Anthropology and the Savage Slut, the Poetics and Politics of Otherness. That paper took anthropology to task for their making of colonial otherness. In linguistics, especially in Creole studies, I too have taken some of my colleagues to task for implicitly upholding this colonial early mission of Creolists who participated in the creation of other, irregular, abnormal types of languages. And in my analysis, this was part of a dehumanization process, very much like Schleicher's family tree for grades of humanity. So what Creyòl called the savage slut in the context of anthropology, I myself have called, more benignly perhaps, Creole Exceptionalism in the context of Creole studies. One thing that has become clear to me now with the recent and much needed Black Lives Matter movement is how fraught these notions of other and abnormal can be. In my own work, one thing I've been wrestling with in the context of social justice via language and education is the various sorts of teachings, both implicit and explicit, that from the very beginning of a child's life start to make that child feel that they are the other, the abnormal, the deficit in the classroom. Sometimes even in their own country, like in Haiti, and even in their own schools and communities. Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye, can help us understand in a visceral way the impact of such systemic racism against individual Black lives. So The Bluest Eye is a story, basically à la Frantz Fanon, of how systemic racism can lead to self-hatred, as in the story of the main character, Pecola Breedlove, the protagonist of that story. So Pecola is a Black girl who wants blue eyes because she believes that having blue eyes will make her happy. Why does she believe that at such an early age? Because all that she sees around her are symbols of hegemony that make her believe that Black is ugly. And linguistic prejudice is among one manifestation of what Toni Morrison called the bluest eye. In Haiti, where most Haitians are Black, like me, children still suffer from structural racial violence. So this photo that you see here is from a school in Haiti, in Lagonave, and the next one is from my own kindergarten years, which I'll come back to later in the talk. So both photos are examples of the sort of symbolic violence that lead to bluest eye syndrome in Haiti. And in Haiti, it's widespread prejudice against our native and national language, Creole, that makes too many Haitian children feel like Pecola in wanting to be what they are not. So in this case, it's not blue eyes per se, but it's linguistic bluest eye, meaning French, that works as one among other factors of alienation. So one of the main points in this talk is that in Haiti, like in many other post-colonial communities, including in the UK and in the US, children are far too often made to desire a prestige language or a prestige variety of language, often the language of former or present colonial powers, because the native varieties, the native languages, are brutally devalued. And this systemic devaluation is implemented even by human rights organizations whose explicit mission is to promote, quote, linguistic diversity for the respect, quote, of human rights. So one of these, which I'm going to take to task here, is the UN and UNESCO. So the case of UNESCO's fostering the bluest eye is all the more overwhelming as soon as one understands that the very mission of UNESCO is at the antipode of global systemic racism. So UNESCO, like many human rights organizations operating in Haiti, is supposed to promote access, knowledge sharing, freedom of expression, free flow of ideas, equal dignity, cultural and linguistic diversity. So one of my main concerns in this lecture is when it comes to celebrating human rights, not just on December 10th, but on a daily basis, how do we keep ourselves accountable alongside institutions like our universities, Ministry of Education, UNESCO, along with all other national and international institutions in countries in the global south, like in Haiti? Now, from a linguistic and education perspective, the overarching goal is to decolonize or normalize these language varieties that have for far too long been stigmatized and excluded in linguistics, in education, and in the society at large, while other languages are being studied or taught or used as the normal languages, the one with the most capital as quote-unquote international languages. So I will find my lecture in the workshop successful if at the end of it, during the workshop session especially, each of you can decide what you will do next, what action steps you can commit to make all languages, all language varieties deeply matter, so that Black lives too can deeply matter in the UK, in Haiti, in the US, and beyond. So that's the plan. So this is to put the entire talk in context. So I'll start with a personal perspective, a brief linguistic autobiography of myself as a Haitian linguist who for the first 20 years of my own life thought that my own language, native language, Creole, was actually not a language. And we have to understand why, because I was that picola. Then in part two, I'll move from personal history to some key aspects of the intellectual history of linguistics and a bit about also education as they relate to the well-being, or actually the unwell-being, of Black and brown people in post-colonies worldwide, especially those people who speak Creole languages like in my native Haiti. In part three, I look at one case study about Haiti that I hope can inspire action by linguists and educators to help the global Black Lives Matter movement. In the conclusion, if maybe perhaps in the workshop, because of time, we will look at the implications that are more global, going from my concerns about Haiti to concern about speakers of racialized or minoritized languages or language varieties in the UK, the US, and elsewhere. So now we start with the personal, that is political, my early days. So right off the bat, I need to say that those issues about Black Lives Matter movement, about decolonization, are not, for me, purely academic. They are very personal. And from my childhood onward. So this bit of autobiography is necessary for full disclosure, because you'll notice that I take these issues very, very personally, because indeed they are personal. It's not just linguistics in academia. It's a matter of really personal liberation, which I'm still working on. So let's start with the way I was socialized by family and schools in Haiti. Okay, so I like to say that this is when I was cute. The photo on the right is First Communion. I grew up in a very Catholic family where my parents had a very clear idea of what it means to be a good child. And being a good child included going to a French Catholic school taught by French brothers, Saint Louis de Gonzague. And this is the sort of report card that children would get every week from the school. So the top photo is the front of the card. So you see très bien, meaning very well, classe de 10e, this would be third grade in the US. And the interesting part is the bottom photo with the school's regulations. So rule 1 is about absences. Rule 2 is a ban on weapons, like knives. Rule 3 is a ban on loitering. Rule 4 is a ban on the use of Haitian Creole, which I call Creole in this talk, as it is called in Haiti. So what's striking here about this ban in Rule 4 is that Creole is our one single national language, spoken by everyone in Haiti, while French, the primary language of instruction, is spoken fluently by at most 5%. Okay, so not only was Creole forbidden, but even our textbooks too would colonize us into self-hatred. So here's a sample from our Haitian literature textbook, citing a famous Haitian poet called Boer. So the first highlighted passage tells us that Creole is ridiculous and can be of no use to Haiti. The second highlighted passage tells us that Creole will never be anything but an inferior variety of French, a patois. And the third passage asks parents that they never speak Creole to the children and that they show no mercy in correcting the children's Creolisms. That is, any influence of Creole onto French must be punished. Now, you need to understand that Haiti is a country where most people, including most parents, speak Creole only. So in effect, this literature textbook asks of these parents that they never speak to the children. And if they ever manage to speak French to the children, then they should avoid any transfer, any linguistic influence from the native Creole. Now, as linguists, you know that this is impossible. And that's the kind of families and schools I grew up with, except that my parents were part of the 5% who could speak French to some degree. So it's important to stress that this sort of linguistic discrimination is part of more general patterns of racial discrimination. The language issue is only one reflex of racial or racialized injustice. So this photo, again to the right, of Toni Morrison's book, is the cover of my diary notebook from kindergarten. Recall Pecola Breedlove in The Bluest Eye, who wants blue eyes to escape from a black life that does not matter. Like most kids in Haiti, and like Pecola Breedlove, I grew up with beautiful images of white children speaking French as the standards of racial beauty and linguistic excellence. So in Haiti, again, the bluest eye syndrome, as described in Toni Morrison's work, affects the entire nation because from a tender age, most institutions in Haiti, from the schools to human rights organizations like UNESCO, promote French as the gold standard of excellence. We'll see more of that in part 2 of the talk. Another problem is that most of our teachers, parents, leaders seem to be totally unaware of this alienation that they cause, that is handicapping children from the cradle onward. So this mental colonization theme will be a constant in this talk. And my plea to you is that you as linguists, educators, book publishers, whatever you do in your life as scholars, as students, as teachers, consider this bluest eye syndrome in your own research and teaching practices. So in my own case, I had to leave Haiti to discover all the ways that I had been mentally colonized and miseducated throughout my growing up there. So my epiphany took place in the 80s when I worked at Bell Labs as a computer scientist with linguists and researchers in artificial intelligence. That's when I discovered what language really was about, and that Creole was not broken French, it was a real normal language. As I was working with linguists and AI researchers developing early prototypes for automatic speech recognition systems, what we now know as Siri or Alexa, that's when I realized that the rules that apply to languages like English, French, Spanish, etc., they would also apply to my own native Haitian Creole. That's how I became interested in linguistics and Creole studies, and the rest is history. Now, we're in part 2 of the talk. The focus here will be moving from personal history to the intellectual history of white supremacy in colonizing linguistics and education. In other words, how have language and education been weaponized to create arbitrary grades of humanity that keep racialized or minoritized groups at the bottom of various hierarchies of wealth and power? So what you're going to see is a series of anti-Creole beliefs, claims, and practices by linguists, by educators, by the leadership of Haiti's Ministry of Education, by human rights organizations like UNESCO, which I take as one poster case because the ambivalence is so spectacular. So in my analysis, these quotes amount to one most explicit program of anti-Black colonial linguistics in education. So, and this is only a small sampling of what I've called Creole Exceptionalism. So what you'll see are mostly quotes from research publications that have made it into the popular press. The point is that linguistics, especially Creole studies, has participated in anti-Black colonial campaigns against Creole languages and their speakers from the very beginning of Creole studies, which started as part of the colonial enterprise, or what the Europeans called mission civilisatrice in Africa and the Americas. So the quote in one is perhaps the most spectacular among in linguistics. What is meant there, in effect, is that when I myself switch from speaking English, as I'm doing now, to speaking Creole, then I automatically become a fossil of humanity. So when I speak Creole and say things like, mes amis, oh, est-ce que entendez parole raciste ça yo? It's as if my brain would revert back to an earlier stage of human evolution. That's a spectacular claim with little basis in reality. If we accept that I belong to modern Homo sapiens, and that my brain cannot be at once modern when I speak English and then primitive when I speak Creole, that makes no sense whatsoever. Yet this claim has been quoted widely, even in the New York Times, thanks to Creolists like John McWhorter. So in quote 2, John McWhorter calls Creole languages the only languages that have started again. And this is a direct echo of Bickerton's colonial program for Creole languages. In quote 3, Creole is called broken French. Now, if we take language as a reflex of mental properties, what it means is that Creole-speaking brains are a broken version of French-speaking brains, right? And this theme is recurrent. You'll see it even in the writing of staunch nationalist Haitian scholars. So lastly, quote 4 is from the New Yorker, calling Creole a guttural French patois. All these claims have been demystified in my own work, and you can find my papers on my MIT website. So now let's look at claims about Creole languages that have direct impact on the actual lives of Creole speakers, because these claims, in effect, have the potential to block access to quality education for Creole speakers. Consider, for example, French linguist Albert Vollmann's claim that Creole languages become endangered when they are used in the classroom. So according to Vollmann, this danger of de-creolization, that is really language death in the case of Haitian Creole, is due to the very nature of Creoles, because according to Vollmann, they are morphologically reduced languages with very little apparatus to express scientific concepts. And that's why, according to Vollmann, it's difficult to use Creoles in education. And if you try to use them in education, like we do at MIT in the MIT initiative, you condemn them to language death, because they'll have to borrow so much from European languages like French, and as a consequence of such borrowings, they will dissolve in these so-called major languages. Now, this is a very serious concern, because if Vollmann was right, if he were right, because he's not right, it would mean that efforts such as those that I'm engaged in at MIT with MIT Haiti would actually cause Haitian Creole to eventually decreolize, that is, die out. So this is colonial linguistics to an extreme degree, forcing Creole languages outside of the classrooms because of the alleged structural poverty. Sadly enough, this myth about decreolization is one that is still being repeated, even in Haiti, even by well-meaning linguists and educators who, unfortunately, have been brainwashed by colonial scholars like I myself used to be once upon a time. Now, let's look at cases where anti-Blackness can be seen even among Creole speakers. I'm going to share now some quotes where you can see a clear link between global geopolitical hegemony and internalized racism among Creole speakers who believe that those Haitians who do not speak French are either subhumans or they're not mentally evolved. So the author in the quote that you see here is 19th century anthropologist Antonio Firmin. Now, October 18, just a couple of months ago, was the 170th anniversary of Firmin's birth. He was born in 1850. So Margaret Thomas, archivist of the LSA, paid due tribute to him, stressing that Firmin's intellectual legacy is on a par with that of Franz Boas. Now, what's striking here is that Antonio Firmin, indeed, was a passionate militant against racism. He wrote a major piece called On the Equality of Human Races. Firmin's book was a powerful response to the racist treatise by French anthropologist Gobineau, who had written a very popular book called On the Inequality of Human Races. Yet Firmin like many of his contemporaries, and like many Haitians today, believe that Haitians need French in order to evolve mentally. Which means that Haitians who speak only Creole, the majority in Haiti, are not yet mentally evolved. That's another serious claim. In effect, it's a claim about the inequality of human languages, in effect, about the inequality of human groupings as well. Now, with language being a proxy for racialized communities, if not race per se. So the quotes in 2 and 3 are in the same nature, right? So, and again, these quotes are stunning because they are from nationalist intellectuals, well-known, progressive, very independentist Haitian intellectuals, who yet think of Creole as a handicap because of Creole's alleged deficiencies. So that's quote 2, and quote 3 is from one of the most recent, is one of the most recent, and it comes from no less than the famous historian and former president of Haiti, Leslie Manigat. So in 2010, Manigat, who actually is a major scholar, he called Creole a limitation and an infirmity, even though since 87, Creole by law has been Haiti's national language and is co-official with French. So one of our own presidents declared that our national language was a limitation and an infirmity. So this is, again, hegemony to the utmost degree. Now, we can link these anti-Creole attitudes to claims by linguists about Creole languages. For example, Manigat himself, he believed that why Creole was such a handicap is because Creole evolved from pidgins. It evolved from some broken pidgin French, which in his book, Manigat called petit nègre, which I won't translate because somehow in French it's not as ugly as if I were to say this in English. So I'll just say it in French, petit nègre, which you can imagine, use small and then the N word. So by the way, that's a belief I grew up with. And this notion of Creoles arising from pidgins is one that you'll find in most linguistic intro textbooks. So here you can see the link between, on the one hand, internalized racism and hegemony in Haiti, and on the other hand, what linguistics textbooks teach us about Creole languages. So look at this definition of Creole languages in a classic textbook by O'Grady et al. What does it say? It says that at the onset of language contact, when you put speakers from different languages together, they create a pidgin that's a contact language with very reduced structures and with a, quote, macaronic, and I remember that term, that's a term from Bickerton, macaronic vocabulary. So macaronic is a technical term from Derek Bickerton, which means that the language takes different words from different languages and put them together as macaroni. Thus, the children of pidgin speakers, as they learn the pidgin, they turn it into a Creole with which is a full language, but one that's created, as Bickerton puts it, ab ovo, from the egg, born again from scratch. So, and that's how Creole languages are viewed as totally new languages that are supposed to tell us how the very first human languages emerged in the history of Homo sapiens, right? So that's a classic Pidgin-to-Creole scenario that you'll find in most textbooks in linguistics. So now the key question is, are there really linguistic traits that are found in the history and structures of Creole languages and that are not found in the history and structures of any non-Creole language, right? And my answer, after lots of research, is basically no. And I've done this work, for decades, and I've worked with other linguists like Enoch Abo, Rico Mufone, and the answer to me is a resounding no. And even those linguists that cherry pick the data in order to defend this Pidgin-to-Creole scenario, they have to end up by either contradicting themselves or they make the class of relevant Creole languages a moving target that's getting more and more narrow. For example, when various Creole languages are shown to contradict this scenario, for example, Haitian Creole, then poof, Haitian Creole shifts from being the most Creole of Creole, that was McWhorter in 1998, to now being the most decolonised Creole, right? You see, so at first, Haitian Creole is shown as, is argued as being the most Creole of Creoles, but then once you show counterexamples, various analyses that show that it's not bad, then it moved from being most Creole to being most decolonised Creole. Why? Well, the argument is very circular, right? The idea is that, well, the reason why Haitian Creole has been decreolized is because it's in a diglossic environment where French is still spoken. But what do we see in the data, in the archival data? Well, we see that Haitian Creole was already a challenge to that scenario of Pidgin-to-Creole creation at its very early stages, as early as you can find documentation for it. So furthermore, it's a really bizarre claim to say that it's language contact, meaning a diglossic situation, is the reason why Haitian Creole is no longer Creole, because of language contact. When actually language contact is the very factor that triggers the formation of Creole languages. So in any case, various linguists, like my mentor, late mentor, Yves Deja, has argued with lots of empirical details that there is no way that Haiti can count as an example of diglossia, because most Haitians speak Creole only and live their entire lives only around Creole. So diglossia could not be a factor in quote-unquote decolonising Haitian Creole. So anyway, now if you consider the notion of macaronicity as a criterion for Creoleness, now think of English, right? So English is well known, and this is the School of English at Sheffield. English is well known to have 65% of its lexicon with non-Germanic origin, right? And yet, if you think of Haitian Creole, its lexicon is mostly from French, 90% from French. So which means that in terms of macaronicity, at least, Haitian Creole is much better behaved, so to speak, than English. Well, if we compare the two, then the English lexicon is way more macaronic than that of Haitian Creole, which in effect means that English has out-creoled Haitian Creole, right? Even though Haitian Creole is supposed to be one of the most Creole of Creoles. So you can see that it's a contradiction. Why? Because the assumptions that we're starting with are problematic. And now if we go to French, what do we see? If we compare French to Latin, again, if we cherry pick our dimensions for comparisons, we see that French is very different in terms of its syntax and its morphology from Latin. In fact, if you compare Latin to French and then French to Haitian Creole, along these dimensions, word order, whether you have scrambling or not, whether you have overt case, inflection on noun phrases, whether you have an article that's definite, French is more distant from Latin than Haitian Creole is to French, which means that in that comparison here, which is tendentious, I admit, but I just want to show you that you can always pick your features of comparison in a way that might make one language look more Creole than the other. So in this case, it's French that out-creoles Haitian Creole. So my colleague, Mufwene, actually before Mufwene, Antoine Meillet, a well-known historical linguist, actually argued in the early 20th century that actually French is much more distant from Latin than what you would expect if one were to assume that language change only change parametric features of the syntax in a very gradual way. What Meillet argued is that, in fact, Romance languages are very, very remote from Latin in terms of typology, which would make then the whole set of Romance languages much more Creole than Haitian Creole from that perspective. Anyway, Mufwene has shown with some beautiful maps and beautiful documentation that in terms of historical development, the way that Creoles have emerged, it proceeds on a par with the formation of non-Creole languages like Romance. So if you look at the history of Romance languages in Europe, let's ask, how did Latin give birth to Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, etc.? So there are two key concepts that we have to think about here: migration and language contact. So if you look at this map, what you can see is that Latin seeded the Romance languages when Latin speakers moved for conquest into other parts of Europe. And it's language contact between Latin and so-called back then barbaric languages such as Celtic and Germanic. This is what triggered the formation of Romance languages. And that's exactly what we see in the history of Creole languages, in the case of French-derived lexicon Creoles, with French as the new imperial language instead of Latin, moving into new territories for conquest, like Latin speakers did back in Europe. And then what you see is that, like in the case of Romance, inheriting words from Latin, so the Creole languages that were produced by contact between French and African languages, they also show this lexical inheritance from French, right? So from that perspective, then the history of Creole languages with French-derived lexica is very similar to the history of Romance languages. Okay, so now more recent work from linguists like Blasi, Michaelis, and Haspelmath have shown using, I like to call this big data against the big dogmas of Creole Exceptionalism, because using big data, what we've shown is that if you look carefully at the whole range of structures and patterns comparing Creole languages with non-Creole languages, the result is straightforward. The grammars of Creole languages do inherit aspects of the grammars of the languages that were in contact during Creole formation. So therefore, there is no reason to believe that Creoles were created, quote unquote, ab ovo from pigeons. And then the data are very robust. So here, the big data scenarios very strongly argue against the classic Pidgin-to-Creole scenario that most linguists learn in Introduction to Linguistics, right? So we have a job to do to revise those textbooks. So the point is that Creole languages are not exceptional. They are normal human languages. And I agree with Morrison and Meyer when they say that racism is the reason why Creoles have been otherized in linguistics. But they were optimistic in saying that this was a problem for the 19th century. So what we're seeing here is that this is a problem for the 21st century as well, right? So Morrison is right that from the right perspective, a Creole is nothing more, nothing less than just a language. So the term Creole for me has validity, but strictly from a historical perspective, it describes a particular set of social historical scenarios that were created by colonialism. But Creole is not a term that can refer to structural linguistic patterns that would exist in all and only Creole languages. So Creole is a historical term, not a structural linguistic term. So all we need then to truly decolonize linguistics is a new theory of Creole formation, which accounts for how Creoles emerge, but also for how non-Creoles emerge. So, and this is the work that I've been doing with my colleague Enoch Abu, and we have a paper with the title, A New Theory of Creole Formation, which you can look up on my MIT website for more details. But what we have to understand here in the context of decolonizing linguistics is why this insistence over centuries that Creoles must be a special type of language outside the typology of, quote, normal languages. So this map here suggests that these claims about Creole languages are embedded in the very history of the triangular trade, where the Europeans, the goal was to make Africans into lesser humans for economic reasons, right, for slavery. And for that mission to succeed, the Europeans had to convince the Africans and also convince themselves, the enlightened selves, that the Africans were lesser humans. So they had to believe that, therefore, the Africans could only speak lesser languages, be they African languages or be they Creole languages, whatever they would speak, had to be lesser because it had to fit the brains of lesser humans. And this is, according to what I see in the data and in the literature, the roots for the stigmatization of Creole languages from then forward. And I want to stress that this use of language and linguistics for politics and for dehumanization is not peculiar to Creole studies. So I'm going to share with you examples of this use of language in colonizing Black and brown people around the world through space and time, both in the history of colonization, but also in the history of linguistics. I'm going to walk you with examples with a variety of colonial languages and in linguistics, Spanish, English, and then French. And I'll go back to Schleicher as well. So let's start with Spanish in 1492. So this is the same year when Columbus got lost in the Americas. So this is a story about the first Spanish linguist, grammarian, Nebrija. So what Nebrija understood in 1492 already is something which sociolinguists, psychologists, and philosophers have researched in great detail: the power of language and culture for hegemony. In this vein, I like this quote from Stephen Biko about the foundations of apartheid in South Africa. So Biko said very powerfully that the most powerful weapon of the oppressor is in the mind of the oppressed. And that's exactly what the Spaniards, like Nebrija, understood when they launched the conquest of the Americas in 1492. So here's what Nebrija told Queen Isabella back then. He said, look, my queen, you have to impose Spanish to the savages of the New World, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and so on, because once you do that, you'll be able to control their minds. You'll be able to convince them that they are inferior and must be ruled by Spain. Okay? So this is actually very powerful because it brings in the brutal imagery that's so very relevant today to the Black Lives Matter today. Because it told the queen that you will have placed your yoke upon many barbarians who speak outlandish tongues. Now, if you think of what a yoke is put on someone's neck, on the cow's neck, right? So now think of this imagery of George Floyd having a knee on his neck. Okay, so that was Nebrija back in 1492, asking to put a yoke on the heads of the native of the Americans back in 1492. Right. So and the British as well. So here we in the history of the Department of English at Sheffield. Now think of the way the British themselves also understood the power of language as consort of empire. So this is a paper by Lord Macaulay in 1835, and it shows clearly how power and ideology can trump science, or perhaps maybe drive science in a way, especially if you keep in mind that English is an Indo-European language, and as such, English descends from Indian languages. But in his proposal, Macaulay goes against science, even what we knew back then, and declares that Sanskrit is less valuable than English. So in its colonial logic, English is a language that has to be used to educate Indians, really to colonize Indians. So the goal of Macaulay, pretty much like that of Nebrija, was to convince colonial subjects that they were inferior to the colonizers. So what Macaulay wanted to do was to use language and education to create a class of Indians, as he says, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. And actually now we'll see that the same is true in other places of the world with different colonial languages like French, Spanish, etc. So the goal back then was to use language as one more tool, a colonial yoke, to keep Indians subservient to the British Empire. Now, it's fascinating that Macaulay's clearly racist approach to Indo-European linguistics came in advance of the creation of the family tree model of linguistics, whose founder, August Schleicher, had similar white supremacist objectives. Interestingly, because of the way linguistics courses are structured, at least when I was a student, I myself didn't learn about this repugnant history of family tree linguistics. Yet, the origin of this family tree model is so deeply embedded in the history of white supremacy. So this is why we can look at Schleicher's own writings on why and how it came up with this model following on Darwin's tree of life. So Schleicher believed that languages go through a cycle similar to a living being. They start out simpler, then they become more complex. Okay? And so basically the state of this primitive simplicity is followed by a period of growth, which eventually slows and gives way to some decay. Okay, so this is basically Schleicher's theory, is that when you look at the history of languages, you can see that they evolve from being less complex to more complex. And therefore, so the key point here for Schleicher's racist approach to historical linguistics is the point in 3, that language, basically looking at the structure of languages and the morphology, it can tell you about grades of humanity. So the more complex your language, the more morphology you have, the more, for example, if you're more inflected, like Latin, then you're going to be superior in terms of your humanity than a language like Chinese or Creole, for that matter, that doesn't show inflection. So that's Schleicher's approach to quote-unquote grades of men. So now let's move to the 20th and 21st century. And my next case study concerns the role of language in my native Haiti as a post-colony. So in this quote here, what you'll see is Giscard d'Estaing. Actually, he recently died, but he was president of France in the late 70s. And d'Estaing makes it clear why France should promote the French language all around the world. And this is francophonie. Because according to what Justin argues, language and culture are tools for economic and political power. And then this term makes it clear that French is not a gift to the francophone or francophile world. Instead, French is a powerful tool for France's economic dynamism on world markets. In other words, francophonie is not a tool for the development of France's former colonies, like in Haiti or in Africa. It's a tool for the enrichment of France. Coming next, the current presidents of France and Haiti, Emmanuel Macron and Jovenel Moïse. And in that couple of minutes, you'll see clearly the agenda of French imperialism through language and education.
La francophonie est également un élément qui nous unit, Haïti faisant partie justement des membres fondateurs, et je souhaite que nous puissions encourager la région de manière très concrète, et nous allons nous y employer, les initiatives que vous prenez en ce sens.
Au cours de nos échanges, nous avons convenu de renforcer les liens commerciaux entre les deux pays. La coopération en matière d'éducation à tous les niveaux, surtout l'enseignement supérieur et la formation professionnelle. Vous pouvez compter sur nous. Nous sommes en train de travailler pour que le français, comme nous l'avons si bien dit, qui est notre langue officielle, soit en fait une langue, la langue de la CARICOM aussi. Et nous sommes en train de travailler pour que nos frères de la Martinique et de la Guadeloupe puissent participer aussi dans ce grand mouvement de la CARICOM, parce que la CARICOM, ce sont des pays de la Caraïbe. Et je pense que la Martinique et Guadeloupe font partie aussi de la CARICOM. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, messieurs, dames.
So I hope you, although it went fast, that you can see how amazing it is that in 2 minutes, it's so clear the various layers of French colonialism and the role that the Haitian leader plays in cementing French hegemony in the Caribbean. Because basically what Jovenel is saying, Jovenel Moïse, the Haitian president, that is going to push French as the language of CARICOM, because French is also Haiti's official language. And he used official language in the singular, but in point of fact, by law, Haiti has 2 official languages, Creole and French. And not only that, the law makes it necessary that all documents must be produced in both languages, Creole and French. And also Article 5 that you see here in Creole states very clearly that Creole is the one single language that unites all Haitians, meaning that Creole is our one single national language. But yet, when Jovenel Moïse meets with President Macron at the Élysée in France, he says that French is the one official language and that he will push it in CARICOM. CARICOM is the economic union for Caribbean countries. It's a bit like the European Union, but for the Caribbean. And in fact, 25%, we'll see that a bit later, of people in the Caribbean speak Creole, not French. There are many more Creole speakers than French speakers, a point that will become relevant soon again. So now, all this comes to the fact that French in Haiti has been entrenched as a social class marker of prestige, with Creole as a marker of lower class. And plus, there is this component of geopolitics where French, as you just saw, is being used by France as a vehicle for political power, for soft power. And this marking of Creole as a marker of lower class and French as a marker of upper class, or higher class, I should say, it comes from all quarters, both on the local social scene, but as you saw on the geopolitical scene, with the francophonie machine weighing heavily via all kinds of hegemonic institutions like the Académie Française, like the Collège de France. Académie Française is with the Haitian-born Denis Ferrière, which you'll hear now, and Collège de France with, for example, the famous Haitian writer, Yannick Lyons. Now, going back to Pécola and the Brouess Eye, you're going to see a short video by La Ferrière that clearly tells you that if you're Haitian, to be beautiful, you cannot speak Creole, you have to speak French, right? And this is Laferrière, well admired in Haiti, a member of the Académie Française.
Moi, j'ai dit aux gens que quand je parle français, je me sens élégant.
No, so when I speak French, I feel elegant. And actually, so the fact that Laferrière is a member of the Académie Française, that I myself am a member of the Kreyòl Academy in Haiti, I have to tell you about this tale of these two academies in Haiti. So when Laferrière was elected to the Académie Française, there was a major show of support and happiness. And you can see here photos of Laferrière being welcomed by the Haitian presidents, Macaulay, at the French embassy. And yet, when the Akademi Kreyòl was inaugurated with 33 academicians, we were snubbed by the same executive that so welcomed Laferrière. So when we inaugurated back in December 2014, the executive didn't even send any representative to applaud us. And I was never received as an academician in the National Palace of Haiti. And the reason why we're told that the executive that welcome the academy is because the creation of the law for the creation of the Creole Academy was written in Creole, not in French. And therefore, the executive didn't like that and said, well, we cannot go along with that. But fortunately, we had the support of Parliament, which voted unanimously in favor of the creation of the academy. So we still managed to be inaugurated against the wishes of the president, Macaulay, because they didn't like that our law was written only in Creole, even though most laws in Haiti are still being published only in French, in violation of the Constitution. So that's an interesting bit. And so what I want to talk about now is the various other ways that this hegemony, francophonie, infiltrates the way that Haitians, even intellectuals, think about Creole. So this is an article that was published recently by a member of the Creole Academy. And there is proposing to improve Creole orthography. And as you can see here, the normative gaze is from French, because what he writes here in French is that in order to improve the Creole orthography, we have to make Creole look more like French. Now, this is a very strange argument, because his point is that it's difficult for Francophones, for people who speak French, to read Creole. Therefore, we have to make Haitian Creole be written more like French. When in fact, as I mentioned earlier, only 5% of Haitians speak French fluently. But in his proposal here, the 5% who speak French in Haiti count more than the 95% of Haitians who speak only Creole and who benefit the most from the fact that the Creole orthography is phonemic. There's a very nice mapping, a one-to-one mapping between letters and sounds, between graphemes and phonemes that make the spelling very transparent. But yet, for Christophe Charles, an academician of the Kreyòl Academy, he would prefer for the Creole orthography to be etymological, to be more like French. And as you know, when you learn to read in French, you can have a single sound, like a phoneme like O, can be written in at least 40 different ways, with different graphemes, because of the etymology. Whereas in Haitian Creole, a phoneme like O is written by one single grapheme, O. And this proposal is made by a Creole academician, right? So again, just to illustrate the power of French hegemony in Haitian thinking. And what's even more striking is that there is a famous neuroscientist, Stanislas Dehaene, at the Collège de France, who actually, in his studies, is shown the beauty and the efficacy of using phonemic orthographies, because they are very easy to learn by children. So in his studies, after he found out that it's so much better for children to learn in a phonemic orthography, he even suggested that it would benefit French children if the French orthography was more phonemic. So it's kind of ironic that a French scholar is wishing to have French written like Creole, while a Haitian scholar is arguing that Creole should be written like French. And now, to look at a global picture, French hegemony is also what we find in basically all state and international institutions in Haiti, including CARICOM, that I mentioned earlier. So in this slide, what you see is an article by Jacques Pierre, where he looked at all the websites of the government, and what he saw is that most of these websites are written only in French, contradicting the Constitution of Haiti. And that's also what you find if you go to the Ministry of Education. You find that most of the websites are in French. And what's perhaps even more striking is that even the website of the State University is also all in French, although the dean, the rector of the State University is Philippe Desormes, who's an academician. So again, very striking contradiction, where the rector is a member of the academy, but yet all the formal publications of the State University are mostly in French only. So French hegemony is also what we find in the justice system. So which we should call really the injustice system. So the majority of Haitians speak, as you know now, only Creole. 97% about speak only Creole, where the accused, the judges, the lawyers all speak Creole, but the proceedings themselves occur all in French. So the accused has no clue what's happening while they're being judged. So now I'm going to focus a bit on the case of UNESCO for a reason that should be very clear, because UNESCO, again, I'm going to stress that, as such high moral and scientific capital in favor of the use of local languages like Haitian Creole. But what you'll see in the next few slides is that even UNESCO, where there is all this wealth of knowledge, scientific knowledge about the importance of local languages like Haitian Creole, even them participate in creating this blue eye syndrome by recurrently prioritizing French over Creole. And they do that even, say, in the occasion of Access to Information Day. So there was one day that was September 28th when they were celebrating access to information, universal access to information, and the webinar that they had was in French. Now, so some background about UNESCO. UNESCO, since the late 1940s, have been doing research in Haiti, documenting the power of using the local language Creole for education. So they published in 1953 this major monograph on the use of vernacular languages in education. And a couple of chapters of that monograph were about Haiti, were about this research experiment in Marbial, a town called Jacmel, where they showed very clearly that the use of the local language Creole promotes access to education. And up to today, in the 21st century, UNESCO is publishing or helping publish imported documents in Creole. So I'm showing those slides to show you the influence of UNESCO and its scientific standing in Haiti in terms of mother tongue education. But yet, that very same UNESCO, when they do formal meetings in Haiti, when they do conferences in Haiti, the one language that's being used typically is French. Although recently, there's been an effort after lots of complaints on my part at these meetings. You can see that there's been a progression towards allowing Creole or promoting the use of Creole in those conferences. Typically, when the moderator is folks who are Creolists, who believe in the power of Creole. But overall, if you go to the website, you see that most of the conferences, most of the publications are in French only, including when they talk about inclusivity, when they talk about, for example, inclusion, like they had a couple of weeks ago. And when I raised that question, why is it that UNESCO doesn't use Creole? The classic answer is that, well, we want non-Haitians to understand. So we use French so that non-Haitians can understand. And they remind us that French is today the working language, official language at the UN and at UNESCO because of Haiti. So Haiti played a key role in voting in favor of French to become an official language at UNESCO. But what's being missed is that when they produce those documents or those conferences in French only, basically they're excluding the majority of Haitians who, for the most part, speak only Creole as the fluent language. So this is a basic contradiction between UNESCO's principles for inclusion versus the actual practice of using French, excluding most Haitians from the proceedings. Again, this was a recent webinar last week, December 4th. It was about inclusive education, but it was conducted mostly in French until there was one minister who switched to Creole after I asked, please make sure to include Creole so that way Haitians who are most fluent in Creole can understand. and the theme was inclusion. So today, actually, as we speak, there's a webinar happening today. As you can see, it was announced all in French, and the title is "The Right to Education is a Human Right." But one thing that they forget is that UNESCO itself has published tons of papers arguing that there cannot be education in a language that the students don't understand. So that very poster, published only in French, contradicts the very principle of UNESCO in favor of linguistic diversity, promoting local languages. So I don't know yet exactly what language was used in this webinar, but after this, I'll go and listen to see whether it was all in French or whether there was an effort to include Creole, which would be good. And recently, I was engaged in this debate, and I'm giving you all these details for you to understand the ecology of this hierarchy between French and Creole in Haiti. So recently there was an announcement on a Facebook group, on a WhatsApp group, about a conference on science and fake news, and it was advertised, and it was by AUF Caraïbes, and it was advertised that there would be translation in French, English, and Spanish. And then when I asked, how about also allowing Creole, why don't you also have Creole translation, since there are more Creole speakers than French speakers in the Caribbean, and such exclusion of Creole amounts to a violation of the principles of inclusion via diversity of languages. And the response was actually quite shocking. So the response was that, well, this amounts to defamation. So basically a request to include Creole as a language in a conference in the Caribbean, where many would be Creole speakers, such a request amounts to defamation. Now, what we have to understand is that this choice of excluding Creole actually amounts to excluding a quarter of the Caribbean, because Haiti is the second most populous Caribbean country, and most Haitians are mostly fluent in Creole only. So therefore, when you exclude Creole, in effect, you exclude about 25% of the Caribbean from full access to the proceedings. And so what we have to ask now, we have to ask about intent. What's the intent? Is it a malicious thing that UNESCO and, say, in this case, AUF, this agency for Francophonie, is it an accident that they keep excluding Creole? But actually, when you look at their own missions, if you look deeply enough, what you see is that it's not accidental. So the idea of promoting French at all costs is, it's stated here very clearly, producing in French will allow the French language to be stronger in the world, and that will increase the influence of France. So the goal is very clear. In this case, diversity is seen as a way to promote French, often versus English. And here, this is a beautiful argument. This is a famous mathematician called Laurent Laforgue arguing for French for science, and the argument is really stellar, beautiful argument, because his point is that if you look at science in France, science is suffering because most scientists in France use English, but there is one area of French university life that's very robust, very vibrant, and that's math. And he says, well, the reason why is because mathematicians in France still use their native language, French, and that helps them conserve the creativity in math and the strength. And he says, well, and the other way around is that the weakness of France in various scientific domains can be connected to this linguistic betrayal of French, right? So now, if we take this argument and we apply it to the case of Haiti, then what do we get? We get the fact that, so basically today in Haiti, science in all fields is pretty weak. Well, one could say, well, it's because exactly what was pointed out by Laforgue, because Haitians don't get to practice science in their native language, right? So if AUF, if UNESCO were to be sincere in this approach of promoting like diversity of languages in order to promote science, then they would also want to promote Haitian Creole, and which is exactly my plea here, is that let's apply, what's good for the goose is also good for the gander. Let's not have double standards. Let's apply the same principles throughout. But it's clear that, so if you look at a cartoon in Laforgue's article, so here in this image, what you see a French mathematician on the left is code switching. It's describing the Fourier transform, and it's code switching between French and English. And then the reaction on the right is very colorful. I will not read it, so I would have to excuse my French. But what you see here is that from their perspective, Francophonie is a weapon to fight against English. So basically, they see diversity as a zero-sum game between French and English, two kinds of imperialism, and which means that Creole speakers fall on the wayside because Haiti is being used as a peon in this geopolitical battle. This is part 3 of the talk, where I want to get into the weeds of what we can do to basically liberate education and linguistics from these shackles. After we've seen now the power of hegemony, white supremacy, and French hegemony in education, linguistics, politics. So I want to ask, where do we go from here? So in this part 3, I want to be optimistic. I want to share models that I trust can put linguistics and education on the right path as part of the Black Lives Matter movement for human rights and social justice. But because now it's 11:58, so I want to take a break and ask, and I cannot see you, so I'm talking to myself. So I have no clue whether you guys are sleeping, whether you're listening, whether you're happy about what I'm saying, whether you're bored. So, but I trust that Graham will tell me what's the best way to proceed. Should I go on or should we take a break?
We are here and listening attentively. Thank you, Michel. In terms of the discussion, do you have any preference in terms of the thing I was going to maybe suggest is that people indicate in the chat that they have a question, and they can either speak it out via their microphone or type it into the chat, and that way we can kind of keep tabs on the order of questions anyways. As I was saying, the thing that we should do before we go any further is to thank Professor DeGraf for that talk. So I'll people want to turn on. So I'm sure there's going to be some good discussion coming out of that. The thing that I was just said that many of you may have heard is that if we can, I think maybe the best thing would if people want to indicate in the chat function that they have a question, and you can either type your question or say it out loud. So we'll just have it sort of be an open forum in that way, if that's okay with you, Professor DeGraf.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so we have one from Samrat Halder here, who says, this talk is really interesting and amazing. I was wondering what effect could possibly be anticipated due to the globalization of English language as the medium of education, office works, and so on. In today's life, English is considered as a prestigious language in India, and many people don't want to speak their mother tongue. They're all running for English language, either, as you say, to be educated, jobs, etc. Do you think many native languages might get lost due to English language suppression?
It is happening, and it's not just English. So my colleague who's in Jamaica, Hubert Devonish, but he's from Guyana, he's also looked at the impact of even local lingua francas on language endangerment. And what you find there is that, so for example, in Guyana, English also plays a role in endangering indigenous languages, but you also find that the local Creole there, Creolese, sometimes also have an impact on language endangerment. So it's not just English alone that has this impact on endangering other languages. So in Africa, you also find it. So my colleague Mufwene, so Samrat Haider, you might want to look at this article by Mufwene in Language, I think from a couple of years ago, where it took an interesting look on this notion of what language threatens what other languages. And sometimes it's not only the European language. So it's a fantastic question, but it's sometimes more complex than saying only English or French or some other European language as a language that might create this loss of local languages. And what people are doing, people are just trying to people have to survive. People have to, and often the forces that push them to want to adopt another language is economics. They have to feed the children and they have to compute how they're going to survive. That's why I find the case of Haiti to be quite an interesting control case, because in the case of Haiti, one cannot say that people have to speak French to communicate. On the contrary, when you speak French, you do not communicate, right? So what's pushing French is not a desire to communicate for jobs, because most often you'll do your job better if you speak Creole, because everybody speaks Creole. So why would you want to adopt French as a doctor, as a mechanic, when most of your patients or most of your customers will only speak Creole? It's not for jobs, it's not for economics, because the facts are that, in your job on a day-to-day basis, you're going to be using Creole, not French. So then you have to go beyond this notion of is French being adopted for economics purely. No, it's being adopted because in fact, the pressure is coming from elite closure, this desire to close access to the elite group. This is a term from a linguist called Carol Myers Cotton, who looked at this phenomenon in Africa, that often the choice of a particular language by the elite is not for economic development. It's basically for selfish reasons, to make sure that they protect the class interests. And the same with France. When France promotes French in CARICOM, is to promote the interests of French, because in the Caribbean, French cannot be more useful than Creole. There are many more Creole speakers than French speakers, right? So it's a very interesting question that requires a very layered answer. But I hope I've given you some links to look at a more complex answer to this question. But thank you for raising it.
Yes, thank you. I might suggest, Michel, if you want to add a bit of humanity for your own sake, unless you want to directly refer to your slides at some point, but you might, if you switch out of presenter mode, you'd be able to.
Oh, good. Okay, let me do that. Let me. So I should stop presenting. Okay, let me do that. Let me stop presenting. Okay. Oh, good. I see lots of nice faces. Look at what I was missing, man.
Well, you've got us now, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question.
Good to see you all.
So Sophie Whittle has a question. She says that she's happy to speak it out loud. So Sophie, if you want to turn on your mic and your camera, that'd be great.
Hi, Professor DeGraf. Thank you so much for your very interesting talk.
Thank you for your tweets, Sophie. You've been tweeting. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. So I've recently been teaching a historical linguistics module, which is run by Graham. And as I was looking at Creoles, I was sort of questioning a lot of the arguments that I put forward about, especially Middle English as a Creole. So those who argue for the argument often say that, like you mentioned, Creoles start over, and English lost a lot of inflections, and there's this sort of notion that Creoles are simplified in this respect. And on the other side of the argument, there's the fact that Middle English didn't arise from a pidgin, so how can it be a Creole?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know some more of your thoughts on this, and yeah, what you think.
Well, it's interesting because if you take that definition of Creole having to arise from a pidgin, and if one were to say that Middle English would not be a Creole because it did not arise from a pidgin, then one will have to say that most Caribbean Creoles are not Creoles, right? Because in fact, Mufwene has a paper which I cite. I'll be happy to send the reference to Graham. In fact, okay, so Graham, I cite Mufwene in that paper I sent you in my response to.
You do, yes.
Yes,
I have it circled as essential reading now.
Exactly. So that paper, Sophie, has a reference to Mufwene's paper, showing that in fact Creoles do not arise from pidgins. It's a pretty straightforward fact to document. If you look at the earliest archival data, say about Haitian Creole, there is no trace of any pidgin. In fact, even the folks like Peter Backer and others who still promote this notion of Creoles being very simple because of the Pidgin origins, they have to admit that they don't have evidence of a Pidgin in the Caribbean. So it's basically a very circular reasoning that pushed them to want to keep that Pidgin-to-Creole scenario, because there is no evidence in the archival data for a Pidgin. From the earliest documentation going back to the 17th century, there was a paper by, I think it's William Stewart, on a very early court transcript of a Creole speaker in Martinique in the 17th century. And I've used that in some of my papers, so you can find a reference there. There is no trace of a Pidgin. So that argument that the language should not be a Creole because there is no Pidgin, then we'll have to discard all Caribbean Creoles, or most of them, from the class of Creoles. So in my own view, again, there is no structural criterion to classify Creoles as Creoles. It's all about history. From that perspective, one could say, well, in English is not a Creole because it doesn't share in that history of colonialism and plantation slavery, and therefore that doesn't make it a Creole. But that's a very different way to say it's not a Creole than saying that it's not a Creole because of its structure or its diachrony. Yeah. So the question is going to depend very much on what you assume about Creole formation. And this is what I debate in my own work, that most of these assumptions are problematic, one way or the other. So if you were to assume that there is this discrepancy between the lexicon and the syntax, then what we find is that, well, then French would be a Creole because there is a discrepancy, as I showed with French and Latin, and then comparing French to Haitian Creole. So if you were to take this question of macaronicity as a criterion for Creoleness, then for sure English would be a Creole, because English, the lexicon of English is very macaronic, very, very macaronic, more so than that of Haitian Creole. So that would make English a Creole. You see, so
I suppose like languages as a whole don't have such strict criteria on that it's placed on Creole languages. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, Sophie. I have so many questions that follow on from that, but I don't want to take the time. But just the idea that the contingency, because the real contingency is often this idea of the Pidgin. So, I mean, if Mufone is saying that, there's not much historical evidence for Pidgins, that's a real, that really undermines the whole argumentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have the next question from Ron Johnson, who said he's happy to ask it as well.
Hello, thank you very much, Michel. Lovely talk. I have a question about Schleicher, 19th century tree theory and the Stammbaum theory, and specifically relating to the idea of decolonizing the curriculum as we teach the ideas and so forth. With as you demonstrated, the theory itself has this repugnant history and beginnings. As Schleicher married these two ideas of linguistic heritage and sort of humanity and degrees of humanity. My question to you is related to how this theory has then developed and been used since then. I mean, even from the generation following Schleicher and the mainstream neo-grammarians, in that this kind of was decoupled, and the humanity aspect has been stripped away, leaving this linguistic heritage genetic model, which has proved incredibly fruitful as the basis of an entire branch of linguistics. So, given that, what do you recommend that we do in teaching this?
That's a great question, because the question is, do we throw the baby with the bathwater, right? So I'm not. Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I appreciate your concern, because you're right that this model has been very fruitful in understanding the history of a variety of languages in the cooperative method, has given us lots of beautiful results that in a way show the unity of our humanity, right? So in fact, what Macaulay was arguing in terms of English being more valuable than Sanskrit, if one takes the Stammbaum theory very seriously, then you have to say, well, this isn't hold, because English derives from Sanskrit. And we have lots of evidence based on the comparative method to argue for that. So yes, so we need to decouple the origins of the model based on very clearly racist, Eurocentric, chauvinistic viewpoints of Schleicher versus the actual working of the model. I agree with you. But at the same time, we also need to keep in mind that that family tree model has other limitations. If you think of the work of Hugo Schulhardt about whether languages are mixed or not, the fact that in the case of many languages, you have lateral contact, right? How do you account for them in a model where each language has exactly one parent? Do you need to go beyond this model? Because if you think of it very deeply, this family tree model presupposes that there is such a thing as a pure language, where a language has exactly one parent. So in the case of English, it could be some Proto-Germanic. In the case of French, it could be Latin. So do you want to keep that assumption alive, or do you want to have your students be a bit more reflexive about it? So, well, we also need to think of all the ways that we can understand how more than one language can influence the identity of a descendant language. So you might need to go beyond that metaphor or the structure of that theory. Right. So I agree with you that we can decouple the origins versus the workings of the theory, but I think I would also want students to be a bit more reflexive and critical about the limitations of the theory itself.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Ranjan, again for asking that question. That's a very poignant question because I'll be talking about specifically that with the second-year students next week. So the one of the questions is, what we gain from the tree model versus alternative models like things like the wave model.
That's right.
But the thing you can't do with the wave model that you can do with the tree model is diachrony. But as you've also pointed out, there's also the fact that Creoles sit they sit as sort of abnormal within that sort of that diachronic story at present, don't they? Which is why it's difficult to integrate them in.
If one were to use what I call uniformitarianism in Creole studies, if you were to apply the very same interpretive method that you apply, say, to English and to French, then Haitian Creole would fit just fine as a Romance language. So in fact, one can use, in this case, one can use the model to ask, why is it that linguists who've claimed that Creoles are abnormal from that perspective, you can ask on what basis? So maybe the clearest argument for that is the book by Thomason and Kaufman. Thomason and Kaufman, they have a chapter. In fact, in that book, they also talk about language, whether that's a Creole. But just have a chapter, actually a couple of chapters, where they describe Creole formation as abnormal transmission. And they try to give criteria on the boundary between abnormal and normal, you see. But when you try to apply these criteria, you see that they don't work. In fact, I have a paper from 2005 in the volume by Richie Kane and Cinque, where I exactly look at this definition that they provide to see whether Haitian Creole is really abnormal from that perspective, and it's not. It's not. So, yeah. So that's a great question about the various layers of ideologies and how they enter into our linguistic methods.
Did you have a follow-up, Ranjan, that you wanted to?
It's fine. In the interest of the other questions, we can come back to it if we have time. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions going up. The next is from Emanuela Santos. Emanuela, did you want? I'll read out your question since you put it here. So she starts out by thanking us. Thank you for coming. I have a question regarding issues.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you so much, Professor DeGraf, for being with us and giving us this fabulous talk. I actually organized a module together with my colleague Alice Core that was called Mid-Fetch and Power, because we create global languages, and we're now calling it Language and Power, that addresses precise questions. And we use some of your work in this module as well. One of the examples that we deal with when we're talking about language contact and post-colonialism, the impact of colonialism, because we basically talk about post-colonial studies and linguistics in the same module. So one of the things that we go into is the case of Cape Verdean Creole. And one of the questions that we see over and over again when we look at what people's been writing, and when I've interviewed people who publish and who do poetry in Cape Verdean Creole in Cape Verde, is the fact that they're really trying to come up with Cape Verdean Creole as being, it's already an official language of Cape Verde, but the problem is that they have, well, some can consider the problem, is that they have different varieties in the different islands. Cape Verde is an island nation with 9 islands, and the varieties of different islands, to some speakers, are considered to have grown quite far apart. So the challenge for them is to choose, they say that they usually would have to choose one variety of Cape Verdean Creole in order to actually, get to the grips with the work of making it truly co-official together with Portuguese. So my question with you, for you is if you know of any such issues when it comes to your experience and study of Haitian Creole, and what could we learn about this whole effort of
that's a familiar issue. So there was a long debate back in the 70s, 80s, and in the 90s about which variety should be used as the standard. And that debate became very pointed in the late 70s when we had to pick an orthography, an alphabet, which I mentioned in passing earlier. The phonology of the different varieties can be quite different. And often there are clear social class correlates to these varieties. For example, the Creole spoken by the bilingual speakers it has a different vowel inventory, which includes often vowels from French. I mean, the classic case is that of the rounded vowels versus the unrounded ones. So the bilingual speakers, they have vowels like U, E, but often these vowels in the language of the monolingual, typically they are unrounded. So they are E, A, and E. Okay? So what do you do with the orthography? Are you going to have an orthography where the rounded vowels will have associated graphemes or not? And it was actually a very passionate, often very disruptive debate. And at the end, what he decided is to go for the varieties that were spoken by most in Haiti, right? And then the argument was that, well, the bilingual speakers, in any case, many of them already favor French. And those who are in most need of a robust phonemic orthography is those who speak Creole only. So therefore, if we have to make a choice, then let's pick the variety that's spoken by most, by the monolingual speakers. You see, in this case, those rounded vowels, they were not present in the speech of most Creole speakers. So it made sense to say, well, we're going to not use them in the orthography. And if you're a bilingual speaker and you read a text where the graphemes do not represent those rounded vowels, you can still read them as you'd like, which is true for most languages. So there is no orthography that's 100% representative of all varieties. There's always some abstraction that you have to do, unless you use the IPA, which is unpractical, right? So to that extent, I think the choice was a good choice. In the case of Cape Verde, I don't know the degrees of variation in what domains they are, and what are their class correlates, what are the demographics, is there a variety that's most spoken by Cape Verdeans? So those will be the factors that we want to consider in deciding whether or not to represent all the variants. I know the work of Maëlys Baptista, who was right here in Cambridge doing a thesis many years ago. And she documents a variety spoken in different islands. But my take is that for the case of Creole, I'm very happy with representing variants from different dialects. So when it comes to the TMA system, how you express tense, mood, and aspect, the way they do it in the South is different from the way they do it in the North. The way you express possession, so there are certain expressions that you only find in the North. To say my friend, you say zamiyam. In Port-au-Prince, you would say zamim. So you have zamin for my friend. In the North, you would say zamiam. But I think I would even recommend that we include both. You see, in this case, including both is not such a stretch. In fact, you want that if you're writing a novel and if you want to represent characters from different parts of Haiti. It's nice to be able to use those different dialectal patterns to convey identity. It's a nice thing that the language gives you. The same is true for any language variety, right? Where dialects have this power to very quickly identify your protagonist. So in that case, it's a big plus. Often, like in the case of Haiti, people approach it as if it were Haitian Creole was really special, that therefore, we have to have one standard and then everyone's supposed to be the same. So no, all languages have variation. Let's see how much of it we can countenance in our quote unquote standards. It's nice to have standards that can be inclusive. Talking about inclusion, we don't want to exclude people necessarily. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you for the question.
I believe our next question comes from Dr. Thomas, who I believe is all the way from Lawrence, Kansas.
Yes, Dr. Thomas.
Hi, Michel. Nice to see you again.
I see you again.
Yes, and it's Mbalia. I realize my Google name probably does come up as Dr. Thomas, but it's Mbalia. I have a question, and I'm having a hard time wording it, but it is this. I am a professor of TESOL. I work with teachers in terms of helping them to think differently about the kind of language that people labeled non-native or non-standard users of English speak. My passion is African-American speakers of English or African-American English. And part of my goal and my teaching is to help pre-service teachers, future teachers, to think about African-American English in a much different way and to allow students to use those Englishes in their writing. So in the sense of translanguaging, et cetera, et cetera. The question I have is, why can't African-American English be a Creole? Like, how come African-American English isn't considered a language? What is the process that a language has to go to even get to be a Pidgin and then to become a Creole? Because without formalizing African-American English as a language, people aren't persuaded to write books and using this dialect or vernacular or whatever people call it. So I guess my question is, is there a way to think of African-American English as a language all on its own so that we can stop talking about it as a dialect?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm always reminded of, was it Reinreich? The way you define a language versus a dialect. Do you know that quote from Reinreich?
Yes, it's the one about an army and
exactly.
Yes,
exactly. So that a language is a dialect with an army and navy, and that's what you're dealing with, which is the fact that it's hard to come up with rigorous linguistic definitions that will tell you what's a language and what's a dialect. In fact, dialects is all we have. We have dialects and idiolects. There is no such a thing as one language that's spoken the same across all its speakers. So any language that you take, even perhaps in the most isolated community, even like in the Faroese Island, I remember the work of Diana Jonas. She did a thesis about Faroese Island, very isolated community. And what she found there is that even there, you have, in very interesting ways, having to do with where you pronounce the verb, you have different dialects. Some speakers pronounce the verb in a particular way, at a particular height of the structure, and other speakers pronounce the verb lower in the structure. And this is very consistent. So therefore, even there you have, so which one is going to be the dialect, which one is the language? Obviously, the answer is not a linguistic issue. It's an issue of power, as you point out.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I would recommend so there's a group of linguists, maybe you know them, Charity Hudley and Christine Mallinson.
I just saw that reference in your presentation.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I would recommend that you read a series of books about that very question, which is how to encompass the use of African-American English in the classroom and how do you give it legitimacy. And if you think of the work of folks like Toni Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, they use African-American English as a language. They wrote it. Of course, there wasn't like a standard orthography to write it, so they had to be very creative in how they choose the spelling of these words spoken by African-American speakers. But they use it as a language, right? So from the perspective of the language being a set of dialects, the issue with not using it as a language is a political one. And I think that we have to just push and use it as such, that in your work as a TESOL teacher, make it valid. And in fact, there's research by John Wickford and others that show that when you do that, kids who come from these backgrounds where they have AAE, American English, as the home language, they do better in school. Once they see that AAE is recognized as a language,
right.
And then they have to learn to code switch between AAE and mainstream English. When they have this validation that it's a language, then they feel honored, and they do much better at learning the mainstream standardized writing.
Right.
You see, so I'd love to keep talking to you about this, because I think it's a very important question. Is
yes.
how to normalize those varieties, how to make them acceptable in essays, at conferences, and one could do a workshop on that, right?
Absolutely.
In fact, Charity Hudley and her colleagues they're doing a volume where they're inviting linguists and other educators to chime in on some of these questions. So I think you might be interested in being part of that project. When I advertised this talk on my Facebook page, she did say it would be great if folks would want to contribute to that volume about varieties of English, including AAE, to decolonize attitudes around them. So I think what you ask, I think, would fit very well in this project that they're doing.
Thanks for the response, and I look forward to getting that Facebook information. Yes, thank you.
Samson, and then Alice and Hannah, I believe, is the order of questions we have.
And I guess it's Samson's proud Haitian flag. Comment est Samson?
Moi informé ou même.
Moi là, important là.
Moi content là. It's so great to be here. I'm so excited, and it was a great talk, very informative. I enjoyed it so much. So I have a question, but in your response to Dr. Thomas' question, it's like you touched on a little bit. It may sound a little bit problematic, my question actually. So for there to be a decolonization of Creole in Haiti or in Creole-speaking countries, should language policies be at first depoliticized?
Well, the question is, can you ever do language without politics? You see, I think that's impossible.
Yeah.
You see, I really think that, in fact, de Saussure wrote this piece a long time ago saying that because of the very nature of language being part of everything we do, language being such a big part of defining our identities, and language being often this subconscious tool to create hierarchies, even hierarchies that work against us. We often fall into these traps without being aware of it, of thinking that our language or someone else's language is superior or inferior. From that perspective, it's nearly impossible to do language, or linguistics for that matter, without politics. I often shake my head when my colleagues in Creole studies or in linguistics say, Michel, why are you being so political about those theories? They're just theories. You see, just look at them as scientific hypotheses, and then just go about with your data to show whether you're right or wrong. Why do you have to go into these issues of racism and colonialism and all that? And I think that's being a bit foolish, because it's like if we're angels. We're not angels. We're human beings. We're part of a society that's from the very beginning has been so enmeshed in using language as a way to classify people and as a way to create, as Schleicher says, grades of humanity. And it's been that from even in the Ancient Testament. Yeah, if you look at the Ancient Testament, there's a story of the Leidites and the Ephraimites, where the word shibboleth came from. So shibboleth was used as a way to distinguish between those two tribes who looked the same, who spoke almost the same, but they pronounced this word differently. Shibboleth. Some said shibboleth, the other ones say siboleth. It's s versus a sh. And that was used to basically kill those who couldn't say shibboleth, right? So the point is that language has always been political. We cannot get outside of that. The same with education. So the way to deal with it then is to try to make the politics obvious, to try to say, well, when UNESCO uses French so consistently, excluding Creole, that's not accidental. It's political, and we have to try to understand what are the politics of that choice. That's often what they tell me. Everybody can make the choice they want. We don't force anyone to use French. People just choose what language they want to speak. So the answer is perhaps honestly very innocent. We just if people we invite just choose to speak French, or they can choose to speak Creole, but most of them choose French, as if the choice of French was apolitical. No, it's not. So our job, Samson, is to make the politics transparent, to force people to reckon that linguistics, education are embedded in what Charity Hudley and Madison and Bushels call this, it's really a history that's repugnant. It's a history where white supremacy has shaped the way we produce knowledge and the way we accept different types of knowledge based on other types of hierarchies. And then we have to just be honest about that and then move forward.
So, yeah, I understand now. It's unavoidable that language inherently involves politics. So, that being said, from your response, like Dehaene said, you mentioned Dehaene earlier. So, there should be a certain democratization then, because if we cannot escape politics when it comes to dealing with language policies, so we have to make sure that the policies work for the greater good. That's Absolutely. Why I think the democratization is important in that regard.
Absolutely.
Thank
Absolutely.
you for this response.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why, although my UNESCO friends don't like it, that's why I always like to remind them, what's the mission of UNESCO? You see, so they have a clear mission. So the research is very explicit. And then you have to ask, are you fulfilling that mission? So how do your choices match or not match the mission? You see, and as you say, if the mission is inclusion, if it's education, if it's human rights, so today is Human Rights Day. If the mission is to protect human rights, then you have to ask, do these choices, do these practices go along with that mission? And it's a very straightforward question. It's a very simple question. And so far, the answers are not forthcoming, you see? And these are folks who are doing the research about inclusion in language.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samson. Next question is from Alice Core.
I've got kind of a question and a comment, and the comment is largely following on from the last three, I think, questions. And just to kind of contextualize the question and the comment is that I'm the other half of the module that Emanuele Santos mentioned earlier. So I'm the formal linguist, and she's the post-colonial decolonialist. Sorry if I misrepresent you then, Emanuele. And I guess my question kind of speaks to this idea of decolonizing or liberating or whatever we want to call it. And the discussion about standardization kind of plays into my question, which is really, I guess it's the sort of how to dismantle the master's house using the master's tool. And funnily enough, the questions, and especially with AAL, were reminding me of what I was doing with a seminar group this morning, which is Rickford and King's 2016 paper about Trayvon Martin, which I recommend to anyone if they haven't looked at it. And because one of the points that comes out is that Rachel Jeantel, who's one of the key witnesses in the trial, is basically because she speaks African American language, she is passed over and she is not listened to and she's discredited. And what my students got out of that paper was, we should standardize language. And I was like, no, this is not what you were meant to get out of this paper. But I think it brings these very interesting questions that were being raised to do with, well, I was saying to my students, well, standardization is a modern phenomenon. Can we not think past it? And certainly, I think when we speak to questions about different Englishes, for want of a better word, one of the questions, again, that's raised in that paper is about, well, if it had been a different language, if it had been Creole, then there would have been an interpreter there. But because it was classified as a dialect of English, then you didn't have an interpreter there. And that goes for court cases as well in the UK. So that was just my comment to that, was just to flag that paper as I think a nice one that speaks to those concerns. But the question I really wanted to ask it is it's the origin story of the module that Emanuele and I put together, which comes from a debate, for want of a better word, that we had about the term Creole, because I came to it back in 2017-18 when we first met, and I was using this term Creole to refer to Creole languages, and Emanuele was aghast because I was using this term that is so much a kind of colonial hangover, and brings with it all this baggage of white supremacy, and you can't really get away from, or at least arguably you can't get away from, its kind of racist colonial overtones, and certainly outside of linguistics. It has its origins and continues to be quite a derogatory term, and as Prof. DeGraf, you say, right, even within linguistics, there's a massive fetishization of Creoles. And I tried to come back to her with this arbitrariness of the sign type of argument, and Emanuele is like, well, that's not good enough. Why do you linguists insist to use this word and insist that it's apolitical? And so I just wanted to ask, what do we do with the word Creole, or the term Creole, or the idea of Creole?
That question, Alice, comes back all the time. There's a small circle of Haitians, very small, I would say maybe 0.0001%, but it's a very vocal 0.0001%, who would like to get rid of the term Creole in Haiti. They would like that we call the language Ayisyen, not call it Creole. Because exactly the point that you make is that the term is so loaded with all this ugly, racist history. Why don't we just get rid of it and just use Ayisyen? You see, and actually when I wrote my thesis a long time ago, which was never published because I became so embarrassed by it, so I call it Haitian in my thesis back in '92. And then I realized that I was being politically correct. But as I did more work in Haiti, work with linguists in Haiti, talk to lots of people, and no, this makes no sense, because what I was doing is using a sensibility from the US about this notion of Creole being tainted by all this racist history, and then trying to impose that on the name of a language spoken by people in Haiti. And people in Haiti, when they say Creole, when they call the language Creole, they have no caring about what European linguists, American linguists think about that term. The term Creole in Haiti is self-contained, and it has very positive connotations often, not always, but often. So we have all these proverbs, like maybe the most popular one is Creole parler, Creole comprendre. So if you're in a room where people are speaking French and then you feel that they are basically BSing, then you'll tell them, look, Creole parler, Creole comprendre. So speak Creole so that we can understand you. Another one is Creole, c'est langue racine. Français, c'est langue achetée. It means Creole is our ancestral language. It's our root language, langue racine, the language of our roots. And French is the language that's bought. Creole, c'est langue achetée. Now, this is a very powerful way to say that we understand this game being played where French is a language of prestige that you have to buy in to be able to progress. But our real language, the one of our soul, is Creole. You see, even in the other proverbs that the answer could be very long if I were to get into all of them. But the point is that the term Creole in Haiti has a specificity that doesn't depend on the way we linguists use the term Creole. The same is true even for a word like the Creole word nègre. So nègre etymologically comes from French nègre, which can be racist. But in Haiti, the term nègre, which comes from French nègre, is not at all racist. In fact, a white person in Haiti can be called nègre. Okay, and back in 1805, Dessalines, the founder of the Republic, he wrote in the Constitution that in Haiti, every citizen is going to be known as Black, whether or not you're white. In fact, there were some Polish and some Germans in Haiti who basically they deserted Napoleon's army, and they joined the fights for independence with the Africans. And so he gave those Polish soldiers a special land that's still there called Fond des Blancs, literally means area of the whites. So in Fontainebleau, there's a Polish community. But even those Polish, legally, once they became citizens of Haiti, they became known as Black. So they understood that Black is a political term. And then you can actually legalize political Blackness into law. So by law, all Haitians were to be known as Black. Okay, and today in Haiti, everyone is neg. Anyone can be neg or neges, which is a feminine for neg. So am I going now to say I'm going to use the word neg in Haiti because of all the racist history of the word neg, or the word Negro, like, you know, I'm not your Negro, Baldwin? No, it doesn't make any sense, because it would be like saying I'm being colonized by racist uses of the term into abandoning my own language, changing my lexicon because of these other pressures. Think of the word queer in English, right? So the word queer, as in queer nation, has been reappropriated by queer people as a badge of identity, right? So language does that all the time, you know, and Creole does it so beautifully. So I went from 92, calling my language Haitian, to now, you know, it's Creole. And I like to remind folks that, look, Creole in Haiti is not your Creole in English or in French. My Creole is my Creole, meaning that the semantics of it doesn't depend on your semantics. It's a different language that's independent. You see, so that's why, you know, your question is an important one. And it's when I write in English, what do I do with Creole? And I just make sure that when I define it, I say, well, it's an ostensive term. When I use Creole in my papers, I don't assume any set of structural patterns. I use Creole as a term to index languages, like in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Guyana, that people call with a term that's local and that connects all languages to a particular history, one of colonialism and one also of resistance. There's resistance there. And one thing which I do, which I've gotten into fights with some of my colleagues, is that I used a capital for Creole. Back in 2003, I had to convince the editor of language to accept that I capitalize Creole, the same way that you capitalize Romance, or that you capitalize Balkan, or capitalize Chinese. You know, I said, well, I want to capitalize Creole. When I talk about Creole languages, I don't want to use a small c, I use a big C, because it's an identity for a group of languages that share a history. The same way that when you talk about Balkan or Romance, you use a capital, or Germanic, use a capital. Why not choose capital for Creole? And some of my colleagues don't agree, but that's what I do consistently. I capitalize Creole, even when I use a term like Creole languages, because it's part of my identity. And it's a global one that puts together other Creole speakers. So it's a long story, but it's ongoing. Sorry for the long answer, Alice, but I hope that touches on some of your concerns.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's that ongoing question of reclaiming it in some areas doesn't necessarily translate to others. I think your example of queer linguistics speaks very well. It's worked in Anglophone spheres, but it doesn't necessarily translate to other languages or cultures. And I think that's the thing that Emanuele and I have been grappling with. So thank you for your answer to that.
I think we probably have time for one more question, and we have one more on deck from Hannah Leach. Hannah, if you got something to add?
I did about 10 minutes ago, but it might well have already been answered by some of the stuff that you've just said, Professor DeGraf, which has been amazing. But what I was going to ask about was how to incorporate the kind of practices of decolonizing linguistics education more generally into topics that seem somehow apolitical. So obviously when we talk about Creole languages, when we talk about sociolinguistics, when we talk about language evolution and language contact, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about to discuss the kind of linguistic theories in a way that moves towards hopefully a decolonized curriculum. But in more formal linguistics, it can potentially be, I had thought it was more difficult to ensure that type of linguistic education was decolonized. But I think from exactly what you've just said in response to Alice's question, from what Samson said, that kind of consistently considering kind of linguistics as a topic and as a topic to be taught as being inherently political is probably the way to do that, is to understand that there is no apolitical research, and that all of the research that we talk about comes from particular political roots, and to understand that decolonization is not something that is you just do by changing your terminology. Obviously, you talked about the kind of deep personal meaning of the word Creole, and how on the one hand we might be like, oh, I'm not going to call it that because it will make everything better, but it doesn't, because it's got so many different meanings. So I don't even think I have a question anymore. If there's anything else you'd care to add, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on decolonizing linguistics more generally. But I think the last two questions and your responses to them have actually really given me more things to think about. So thank you very much. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Well, thank you. The point you make is important. Is that the best way to start decolonizing linguistics is to reckon with the fact that linguistics has always been political. That and that's the point that Hadley, Manninson, and Bushels make in that paper. That's the first step, is to face the fact that this is how it started. It started as part of this colonial enterprise, and it's well documented. And once we understand that, then we have to be self-aware in terms of what assumptions we adopt, and then always look beyond what the textbook says to say, okay, what's the history of that assumption, of that particular claim? It can be difficult because sometimes we prefer to not think of these dimensions. When you do syntax or morphology, it's easiest to just do it, to look at the nuts and bolts of the theory and to supply them. And sometimes it's okay. But other times, usually when you describe other languages where most of the researchers do not speak the language, that's when you get all these very interesting claims being made that often are colonial. So think of the claims about the Piraha. So there's been all this work done on the language Piraha. And if you really look very closely at those claims, they are saying that, and they are claiming about the syntax, the morphology, the semantics of Piraha. And they entail that the Piraha people are not like us. They are very different in very strange ways. They don't have, say, recursion and things of that sort. That's when you need to be really, really careful, and you need to be able to introspect, look at the history of those claims, and yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I certainly feel like I have my work cut out for me immediately tomorrow in revisiting my comparative linguistics material for next week with the level 2 students. So thanks everyone, and thank you again, Professor DeGraf, again for really getting this started with us. So thank you everyone again for attending, and thanks very much, Professor DeGraf. And
my pleasure. No, it was I enjoyed the long time for discussion. Usually it's too short, the discussion period. So here we had a good hour to discuss, which was good. I enjoyed that. So thank you. And thank you for the questions. All the questions were very stimulating.